Let's come to the fourth presentation. And we're putting into a set 13 presentations with a harmonic overview. And that harmonic overview has two different corollaries. One is that there is a reference wave that goes through the set that allows for the tuning of the harmonic, and the other is a carrier wave that allows for the articulation within the tuning to be exact. I want to begin with two sayings. I've made up a imaginary figure based on Lao Tzu and Chuang Tzu. This is our Tzu. This is me. And the first saying, the first wisdom apothegm is, the non-noticeable can be recognizable. That's a little Zen saying. And its corollary, nature loves circles, consciousness adores spirals. We're going to start with just a short reference to string theory. This is volume 1 of 2 volumes published by Cambridge University Press by Joseph Polchinski, who at the time was, and probably still is, one of the world's leading figures in string theory. I bought this set from Joe, and he surprisingly inscribed, "My God, we sold this. Thanks. Now use." Joe. I want to reference something in his very excellent glossary, and then we're going to jump a couple of thousand years to not a parallel, but a deep complementarity. The word here that I'm looking at in the glossary of string theory, this was published in the late 1990s, just a year before Michio Kaku's Hyperspace was published. The term is vacuum. He references here a early French mathematician of the 20th century, Henri Poincaré. A vacuum is a stable Poincaré invariant state, the novel feature of systems with unbroken supersymmetries is the frequent appearance of degenerate but physically inequivalent vacua, V-A-C-U-A. While it is now clear that the different string theories are actually different vacua of a single theory, it is still common to use the term theory for each. Also, different CFTs, conformal field theories, within a single string theory are sometimes referred to as different theories rather than vacua. The term model is used to refer to string vacua whose low energy physics resembles the standard model. And so the mathematical presentation of vacuum, of theories, has reached a point, a series of points, in fact, a threshold of incomprehensibility. One of the difficulties there is being addressed by this series and other series that I have done to reapproach the entire ensemble of not only theories, but of symbolic structures, of the relationship of experience, bridging the things and actions of the world with the symbolic structures of thought, and that experience has a very interesting kind of analog in the term and the use experiment. Experience belongs in the circle of nature, in that cycle. But experiment does not belong there in that circle. It belongs to a different kind of motion, the motion of a spiral. And when that spiral occurs, it occurs in a supersymmetry of chirality, left-handed and right-handed. The penetration into a high consciousness 2,500 years ago included, in classical Greece, for the first time, the ability to recognize that this double chirality was symbolic of something that was larger than entirety, something that was more comprehensive than prehension. And the classic form that it took in poetry of the day is in two of the greatest poets that were there, Pindar and Sappho, a man and a woman. And exactly at the same time that Pythagoras was having his tremendous insights and all the other pre-Socratic greats like Parmenides, the sophistication of what Pindar and Sappho, Pythagoras, Parmenides were able to penetrate through to came out in a form which in Greek is called chorea, out of which we get choral. And it has a structure where there is a strophe, a movement in language, a movement in the poetic characterization of something subtle. And when it has its movement to a certain point where it would be able to complete a circularity, it doesn't complete it, it turns. The Greek term for that turn is metanoia. It means you go above the mind. Metaphysics, metanoia. You go above the structure of the mind because you reverse the field. You reverse that motion so that you go back the other way, and this is called, in Greek and in English as well, this is called the antistrophe. You move this way so far, and then you have a turning, and you move back, and it doesn't complete again, but instead it has a pause. It has an intervaling. The English translation of the Greek word literally means stand, as in stand still. And that this, if put into a parenthesis, this movement, turn, counter movement, stand, that set is the classic dance step that allowed for the emergence of Greek tragedy, the emergence of lyric poetry, and the emergence of comprehensive understanding of history. And in its refinement, the beginnings of what philosophy originally was, the love of wisdom. This is a set that shows us that consciousness is a complementarity to nature, and that consciousness is able to weave back into nature in such a way that when nature would have had a completion, it jumps to another order. And that other order is a further dimension from the 4 dimensions of nature. It jumps, literally leaps, into a 5th dimension. So that if you have a scalar, like the musical scale, 5ths are always interesting, as are 3rds because they're related to them. They're resonant qualities. That leap into the field of consciousness led classically, in India it was the historical Buddha, who recognized that if you have the completeness of nature to its point of turning, and then you follow its perfection to the point of stand, what vanishes is the operator, the protagonist, not from the world, but from the limitations of the natural circle and the implications of the conscious spiral, and a new form occurs that does not record. It doesn't record in the world. It doesn't record in the mind. It doesn't record in consciousness, except that a quality of recognition suddenly flames into play. And the classic way of describing it in Asia, the Buddha would not describe it. He made the method by which one could arrive there. But the person who described it came about 600 years later, and his name was Nagarjuna, and we've talked about this a little bit. One of his classics, it's subentitled in English, A Buddhist Psychology of Emptiness. Nagarjuna's 70 stanzas, and one of the stanzas is pertinent to what we started with, string theory and vacuum and vacua, that all the different string theories are vacua of a single theory, which in itself does not yield an integration. Here's what Nagarjuna said 1900 years ago. What do we mean by arising, enduring, disintegrating, and ceasing? Notice that arising and disintegrating, that we hear it as if there's a deconstruction. It's not a deconstruction. It is an unraveling of what has arisen, and punctuated by enduring, and brought to a perfection by ceasing, not ceasing as it's all over, but ceasing in that this set now is a set of nullity. That the set now is a complete zero, but at the same time, out of time, it is a perfect infinity. Very difficult. 1900 years ago, it was unheard of difficulty to try to appreciate this. And the analytics that were developed out of this became what was known then as the perfection of wisdom literature, prajna paramita literature. And the father of that, grandfather, I should say, was St. Thomas, who went to India from what is today Israel, sent by Jesus to carry his way into India. Nagarjuna says, what do we mean by arising, enduring, disintegrating, and ceasing? These refer to four characteristics of a composite thing. Arising or production means the fresh arising of an identity, of a thing, from causes and conditions. Causes are the things, conditions are the actions. Enduring refers to the abiding of the former continuity of a thing. The former continuity of a thing is its conditionless, causeless field out of which it emerged. A thing is always a thing, a unity. And that unity carries unification, unificality forever. And the word for it in Sanskrit, in order to just designate it accurately, was tathata, which means thusness or suchness. Nagarjuna is saying, enduring refers to the abiding of the former continuity of a thing, that the enduring is a participation in the original zero field. If one is participating in the original zero field, one is not limited by the arising of integrals, of things, of causes, of conditions, and thus it isn't a disintegrating. It is an unweaving of what was woven together to make it a thing, of what was pieced together in terms of its causality, of what the conditionedness gave it as bounds, and thus limits, and thus figurability. Disintegrating refers to that which does not abide in the second moment of the time of its formation. The second moment of its time of formation is the enduring. Arising, enduring, disintegrating, ceasing. The classical Buddha taught that this is a completed set. That the arising, the enduring, the disintegrating, and the ceasing are like the Four Noble Truths. Suffering is real. Therefore, the way to end suffering must also be real. And since they are both real, there must be a real method by which this can be paired and done. And the fourth noble truth is that this understanding, when completed and perfected, is that way. Nagarjuna, 600 years later, jumps it up a little notch. Ceasing refers to the initial moment of a thing changing into the subsequent moment of a thing. That in between, its conditionless, causeless field, and it becoming emergent as a thing, as an action, there is hiatus that one characterizes as ceasing. The best way to say it in English is that there's an interval between 0 and 1. Were there no interval between 0 and 1, ones paradoxically could not be ones. Not only are there zeros and ones, there are always zeros and ones. Each oneness, a quanta, can only be a quanta if it is within a context of 0 emptiness. Thus, Nagarjuna is famous for a Buddhist psychology of emptiness. Emptiness in Sanskrit is shunyata. It's not just empty or void. It is not an emptiness. It is not a void. There's no objectivity whatsoever. That there seems to be an objectivity is a subjectivity of delusion. We're taking, 1900 years later, a great lesson, because in the development of this Mahayana in India, they made the same kind of sandpit, limitless detour that we are making now at the beginning of the 21st century. And we talked last week about the development some 250 years later after Nagarjuna of the development of the Yogacara. This is a chapter of the founder of the Yogacara Asanga's great Bodhisattva Bhumi on knowing reality. The translation was done by a young woman, Janice Dean Willis, who was working out of Columbia at the time. And the Yogacara is a consciousness-only doctrine. And because one expresses it exactly in that way, it was later discovered that it was an idealism, with an emphasis on the ism. It was a mental ism that was so subtle that the symbolic structure of thought could not detect that it was an ism. Because the detection doesn't register. It's non-recognizable, but it is non-noticeable, rather, but one can remember to recognize. And we talked last week about the great Buddhist insight, conscious yogi master who did this penetration, was a Chinese genius named Huineg. And Huineg was the first development of bringing the Hellenistic Judaism of Jesus' great way into synergy with the Buddha's development of the completeness to a ceasing, and that then radiated into China as the Mahayana came into contact with the sophisticated Taoism of China and produced Zen. And the first Zen master was Huineg, the Sutra of the Sixth Patriarch. That his lineage historically traces all the way back through 5 patriarchs before him as bridges from India to China, and then 28 patriarchs in India. And when one goes back, the original patriarchs, the first group, included Nagarjuna and Ashvaghosha. This way was expressed by Huineg in concert with the conclusion of Nagarjuna's 70 stanzas, but in a very high Dharma expansion. This is Nagarjuna's. When the process of disintegration has reached completion and the initial moment of a thing has changed into the subsequent moment of a thing, then the thing has ceased. It has gone beyond the limit of the original moment, which means that the time dimension has now no longer an occurringness. It is not timeless It is that time does not occur so that it's noticeable. What is recognizable is that time is not occurring at all, ever. So that one has jumped from a zero field to an infinite field. That an infinity field is not symbolically discernible as being different from a zero field. Zero and infinity and any logical expression are interchangeable. Except that when you work with quantum physics, when you work with string theory, when you work with the higher math that has developed in the last 100 years, one comes to recognize that infinities constantly occur in the equations and that one has to sift them out. One has to use some kind of a baffle so that they're not there temporarily, so one has an arbitrary cutoff. That arbitrariness of the cutoff is like a signal that one is working with an illusion. There is always a cutoff. And to have confidence that working with an illusion is effective is a delusion. And so we get into a therapeutic condition rather quickly. Koenig, in his natural genius, was not a monk. In the fifth patriarch's entourage, there were hundreds of sophisticated monks. They really knew their stuff. And their teacher was the senior monk, and he really knew his stuff, but Koenig was the dishwasher. He worked in the kitchen late. After everybody ate, he was the only person up scrubbing the pots and pans. And the fifth patriarch had said, whoever makes the real Zen koan best and writes it on this wall provided for it will be the sixth patriarch, be given the robe, be given the bowl, the imprimatur. And so the head monk, accompanied by all the sub-head monks, had written a beautiful little koan up there. Said, the mind is a mirror. If you wipe it clean of dust, it will show perfect reality. So when Koenig, about 4 a.m, finished with his pots and pans, and he was going back, and he had taught himself to read. He was a street urchin. He was a runaway. He looked at this, and he wrote underneath it. He said, the mind is not a mirror. Where is there dust to collect on then? Matsu, the fifth patriarch, early before dawn, looked at this, and it was astounded. And then he put it together because Zen Masters have this kind of insight. So he went and woke up Koenig. He gave him the bowl, the robe, and he told him to get out of the monastery, get out of town, because they'll come after you. You don't have any standing whatsoever. You're not in the pecking order. You're not even a novice, but you are the Zen master. And so Koenig left, and he was an itinerant worker for about 20 years before it finally began to occur to people that he not only knew what he was talking about, he knew what he didn't talk about as well, and became the sixth patriarch, became one of the most distinguished figures in planetary history, as a matter of fact. Nagarjuna as well. But the same thing happened in China as happened in India. A couple of hundred years after Nagarjuna came the Yogacara, came a Sangha, a brilliant logician, what we would call today an ace mathematician, understood all of the ins and outs of the procedures, of the techniques, of the whole thing, like a master mathematician would be today. Knows the names of 400 methods of this and 25 styles of that, and Joe Pochinski writes, in a first look at strings, in spite of its impressive successes, this theory is surely not complete. First, it is too arbitrary. Why does this particular pattern of gauge fields and multiplets exist? And what determines the perimeters in the Lagrangian? A very sophisticated dynamic. The L1 Lagrange 1 point is a point where the gravity of the Earth and the Sun are at an equilibrium, and if you put a satellite there, like the coming one, the James Webb Space Telescope, it will just stay there. It's where gravities come to an equanimity, and whatever is there will stay there. The L1 and L2 Lagrange points around Jupiter, the L1 is ahead of Jupiter in its orbit around the Sun, and there's a whole collection of asteroids there. They're called the Trojans. They lost because they're forever just there. They're caught at the Lagrange point. But there's a second Lagrange point behind Jupiter, and there's a whole cluster of Trojans there as well. They can't go anywhere. What determines the perimeters of the Lagrangian in reality? It's a gravitational equanimity dynamically. How does that occur when space and time are the determinants? Yes, if you could work gravity in, then one could begin to understand it. However, second, the union with gravity with quantum theory yields a non-renormalizable quantum field theory. In order to deal with the problems of higher math that keeps getting infinities, you have to deal with cutoff points and arbitrariness, and then you have to renormalize that, a very famous series of developments in the late part of the 20th century, to find a way that you can at least apply it to things. And it seems to work reasonably well, except that when you get to spiraling really far out, not only does it not work, it becomes filled with infinities. And if you go the other way, it blanks out. Nature is a zero field. It is not noticeable, yet permits occurrence to occur in such a way that what occurs as a thing or as an action is proportional, fractionable, and that each proportion, each fraction, each ratio will itself be a thing, will be a process which can be pointed to, a thing which can be pointed to, and that the pointedness of that is the entire construct then of a geometry, of a cardinality of numbers, of an ordinality of the sequence, of a trigonometry, etc., except that it cannot be said that way in actuality. The classic case in point, the very first statement in Euclid's geometry, his elements. A point is a locus of no dimensions. When it moves, it creates a line, not a line, but linearity. The Greek reads just so that the movement in time is a linearity, but that linearity generates the classic way of saying it in Euclid's day, it generates a plane. And the plane can be rotated indefinitely around that line. The way that one says it since Einstein is that it creates a world sheet. It is a two-dimensional sheet that is described by the motion of the strings in string theory. And if they end on a world line such that it is excerpted out of the world sheet, then they will begin to record thusness out of the vacua. One of the most mysterious of the vacua is the Higgs boson, which has a 0 designation. One drunk physicist said, the Higgs boson is really not a boson. It is condensed vacuum, which gives the substrate that becomes mass when a dynamic becomes an energy polarized into a frequency that creates matter, E equals mc squared. Except that no one knows how a condensed vacuum is able to be the substrate for existence, for thingness. Except that we understand that vacuums are actually unstable. Unstable in the sense that they tend, I have to use a trivializing phrase for a non-trivial event. Vacuums hiccup. Not just once, but they hiccup many trillions of times per time unit, and this is the vibration of energy that registers as a frequency, that permits matter and actions to occur as things. This is a very difficult thing until one brings in the quintessential fifth dimension of consciousness that begins then to make an ecology that absorbs the four dimensions of space-time in transforms. Not only transforms, but transforms of transforms, etc., etc. So that one has a very peculiar, brave new world. Instead of each quanta having zeros in between it, each quanta has infinities in between them. And more surprisingly, the binary of the natural four dimensions is 0 and 1. The binary of consciousness is infinity and 1. The binary of hyperspace is 0 and infinity. Let's take a break. Let's come immediately back to a focus that vanishes. There is a dimensional shift from the mind to consciousness. Consciousness has more dimensions than the mind and can be interfaced only if there is an exchange. In the great poet, yogi, Shantideva, who exposed the limitations of the Yogacara for all time, that if you have a consciousness-only idealism, you are deluded. You have worked enlightenment into the fabric of a symbolic structure, which closes it off. There has to be some way in which a symbolic structure is open to consciousness, which is radically different from not just from the symbolic structure of the integral mind, but from the whole integral circle of the natural cycle. One of the great classic presentations in Chinese wisdom iconography is the 7 great sages of China in a boat, and 6 of them are at one end of the boat, shying away from the 7th, who's way at the other end of the boat on the bow. And the guy on the other end of the bow is Bodhidharma, who brought Zen to China from India. And they don't want anything to do with him. He's like antimatter, that if you touch him, you're gone. Because his speciality is that he is not there and you're there. If you come into contact, you are short-circuited and you're no longer aware or there. Space-time, time-space vanishes. But it vanishes with a supersymmetry, not only into zero, it vanishes into infinity, which is good news. Excellent news. Because it means in the infinite possibilities, there is no impossibility for a vanishing not to re-arise. And this is like the secret doctrine of rebirth where there was no birth in the first place. That the paradox is a possibility. Shantideva in the Bodhikaryavitara says that the Bodhisattva guards the most precious perfection that there is. And the English translation of the phrase that Shantideva uses, the Bodhisattvas protect the secret exchange of selves. What selves when there are no selves? Not the self that psychologically we would conceive of, or the self that we suppose can rise above the fray and become a super self. Shantideva, being a poet seer, enormously conscious, all the way through the ecology of consciousness, understood that there is an exchange between the symbolic structure of thought and the field of visionary consciousness. What comes to the structure of symbolic thought is the remembering. It's like a super energy that carries consciousness as a remembering and gifts the symbolic structure of thought with memory. Remembering as a process out of this infinite field can become, as one of its possibilities, a structure of the memory. And now symbolic thought has a memory where it did not have a memory before. It had rote. It had identification. It had logics. It had conceptions, but it did not have a memory which now changes the way in which the structure of symbolic thought is able to function, because it has, in accepting the gift of remembering, it has given up an aspect of itself called the structure called the imagination. So that now the imagination, when it goes into the infinite field, becomes creative imagining. Now consciousness has not only remembering, it has creative imagining as well. And they, like hunting hawks, they love flying together in the infinite field, because to them, they're at home in freedom. And so the forms that emerge out of this creative imagining and remembering are art forms. And the first art form that emerges out of that is a six-dimensional prism known as the person, who is two orders radically different from the individuality of the conception of I. And anyone else who is a person is immediately a harmonic. And so persons can be tuned finer than logic can grind. In the first edition of the collected plays of Shakespeare, that was put out in 1626-7 by a group of his buddies who missed him. He had died about 10 years before. Ben Jonson wrote the introduction. He said, "Dear reader, you may find herein more wit than you have brain to grind upon. Stay loose, and stay looser than loose, because this guy is acrobatic to the nth degree, like M theory and superstrings. It's just more than you can believe, but if you go along with it, if you play with him, then your creative imagining and your remembering will come into consonance with his. The play is the thing. But the play is not the play, it's playing the play. It's interesting because in the famous Strasbourg studio, the method was always taught. But Lee himself did not teach the method. He embodied methodless, the methodless of the quality of instantaneous tuned. Not just psychically tuned, but tuned in the play. It's the magic of the theater. It's the magic of music. And one of the best illustrations of it, this is a reprint of a famous book called Science and Music, Sir James Jeans. And James Jeans was famous in 1908. He brought out Electricity and Magnetism. And it went through many editions, and this is the 1925 fifth edition. And just 3 generations ago, this was the epitome of being able to understand what physics and math and everything were about. But right near the end of Jean's long life, 1937, he wrote Science and Music, and he has an illustration. It's on page 33. This is a Dover reprint. You can find it all over the net. Here are 2 vibrations that are superimposed, and when they're superimposed, when the 2 different frequency vibrations are brought together in play, they make a new vibratory signature. And that's only 2. every occurrence has its own vibe. There are endless vibes. There is no end of creative forms that are prismatic. Not only more grains than the sands of the Ganges, more grains than worlds without end have beaches to hold them. If, Jeans goes on later, if you take still water and you draw something through the still water, it begins to make a wake, a path. And if you really analytically look at this and keep looking at this, the path begins to have little whirlpools and eddies. If you're in a rowboat and you row, there will be little swirls, little whirlpools and eddies. These are the spirals of instant creativity, and he has a beautiful photo where he took an organ pipe, the lip of the flue of an organ pipe, and put some smoke at the aperture of it, and then made a sound. And you get these wonderful curlicues. That's the sound of that note on this instrument. Can you imagine what a toccata by Bach looks like when you have an infinite supply of smoke? We are looking at the rebirth of wonder. Socrates always said philosophy begins in wonder, but it is carried on by those who are companions together. He says until we become companions together, we really don't learn anything. We regurgitate what we believe, and we argue in detail of why we believe and you should believe. But when we are tuned together, not in a dialectic, the word in Plato actually means a division which can be carried through meticulously until it comes to a unity that cannot be divided any further. And if one is companionable and goes through this tuning together, you will together come to, the Greek word for it is the aletheia, the truth. That both of you, or all of you, who do this really together, you will be able to tune yourselves to something more profound than the actuality of its unity. You will be able collectively together, or paired together, be able to participate in its vanishing and in its reoccurrence as possibilities. That when one went to the Eleusinian mysteries, and it was far enough outside of a city like Athens that it would take almost all day to be able to get there, everyone who was there participated in being tuned together to the vanishing of the opinions of the world. But you did not vanish. Everyone who was there then was able that evening to have a collective dream of no images. A sleep that was refreshing in the sense that when you awoke originally. and that each moment of an existentiality in terms of its action or its form is an articulate non-knowing that gives articulation to the forms themselves in their unities, so that they were called mystery religions. Because what was mysterious was that any occurrence of witnessing this originality has no way to be erased. It is not only permanently there or indelibly there, it is apparent that it never was not there. This is called salvation. It was an illusion to construe that this is difficult when it is reality. What was difficult was trying to maintain the patchwork of the arguments for its difficulty. So that one of the notes here is to this. I always put the notes out in collected form. It's a way of being transparent. I've done it for almost half a century. We are not only faced with problems which we can frame, we are interfaced with solutions which is more complex and cannot be framed. Thus, matrix approaches abound into infinities. The difficulty for us in our current situation is that we are in a reoccurring loop. And the reoccurring loop is due to a mythic horizon being limited to an assumed world that has become delusionary. We had, a couple of weeks ago, the wonderful planetary event of Obama being in Moscow. And again, making arrangements with the heads of Russia, as the head of the United States, that we have to do something about nuclear weapons. We have to not only limit them, we have to begin of reducing them. And that this is paramount because it is very close to getting into a repetition which cannot be stopped. This was an amazing issue in 1986. The conference was held in Copenhagen in dedication to Niels Bohr, the challenge of nuclear armaments. And right away at the beginning, the challenge of nuclear armaments in the biographical sketch of Niels Bohr, which his close collaborator Leon Rosenfeld placed in front of the first volume of Bohr's collected works. This is volume. There are 10 of these. Published in 1970s in Copenhagen. Bohr did not fare too well among blundering statesmen and politically immature physicists. To the former, his candor and directness looked strange and suspicious, and his clear-sightedness was beyond their grasp. The latter, while showing more understanding for his ideas, were no match for politicians and military men. It was the physicist desperately striving under great moral and intellectual stress towards the dark goal of the nuclear weapons who felt the need of calling Bohr to their support. Transported in 1943 from Copenhagen to England by way of Sweden, not without danger to his life, Bohr was suddenly faced, not without his dismay, with the advanced stage of progress of a project he had deemed beyond the realm of technical accomplishment. Although he did take part both in England and the United States in discussion of the physical problems related to the development of nuclear weapons, his main concern was to make the statesman as well as the physicist aware of the political and human implications of the new source of power. One of the implications was that without an ecology of consciousness to match the entire cycle of nature, only nightmares occur. So when Michio Kaku, around the turn of the millennium, put out Introduction to Superstrings and M Theory, being very conscious, he begins his whole book, in fact the preface, with a quote from Niels Bohr. "We are all agreed that your theory is crazy. The question which divides us is whether it is crazy enough." We have an opportunity for the magic theater for madmen only, as Hermann Hesse put in Steppenwolf. The difficulty is that it is not difficult. And so the addiction to deftly mastering the complications which others can't understand, and therefore they pay you to get instructed, or they vote for you so that you have the power, that all of that is a shell game. It's interesting, old Papa Bohr with his pipe and his hat towards the end of his life. He lived until November of 1962. He was born in 1885. And as we talked before, his specialty was always having a crowd of the most brilliant young men around him who he made sure that they understood each one of them was smarter than he was. And he was lovable because he understood, you are all smarter than me, but without me, you would be at each other's throats competitively. And because I'm here as a convenient scapegoat of lesser brilliance, you will be glad to learn in my place by jousting with each other to refine each other's stuff so that you can show what you can do, but eat at my table together. And so he was masterful at that. And he chose the Tai Chi as a part of his family crest when he became ennobled in Denmark. Just like his great mentor, Ernst Rutherford, who, when he was made Lord Rutherford in England, his new royal family crest had Hermes Trismegistus next to a Maori warrior. He was born in New Zealand. He knew how to do Maori war dances. He was a very quiet guy, quite substantial physically, almost never lost his temper, but somebody got to him one time and he told them, looking at them, he said, "I know how to do the Maori dance on you." So let's get along, all right? And in between Hermes Trismegistus and the Maori warrior was the kiwi bird, to show that it's not the fantastic power, it's the fact that this little kiwi bird alerts us to the way to live in tune with this whole ecology called New Zealand. And if you can get along with the kiwi, you can get along with New Zealand, you will do right well. You'll be able to live a life, you and everybody around you. Bohr was interested in the same thing. And next week I'll bring it in. He's the one that wrote the letter to FDR to Franklin D. Roosevelt in 1939 and alerted him originally. He said it is now within reach of having atomic weapons because of a surprising development that was unexpected. We always assumed that fission took very high energies, enormously high energies, and we may not be able to have those amazing, enormous high energies to split the atom. And not just the atom, but an atom of uranium, U-235. But that there was an isotope of uranium that could be split. And that's because several of the electrons were gone, and it made vulnerable one of the neutrons in the nucleus. And a slow bombardment, a bombardment of slow neutrons, is able to penetrate the atomic nucleus and make fission and release other neutrons, which do this, and in less than a picosecond, you have the emergence of an explosive energy that is beyond calculation at that time. This was late in 1939. The difficulty for us is that we have become fearful of a delusion. We are fearful of releasing radioactivity as if radioactivity were the nightmare. And in doing so, we have tried to curb and encapsulate and make sure that it never gets out when radioactivity is an essential of the way in which nature occurs. The first book on radioactivity was 1904, February of 1904. This is the second edition that came out in May of 1905 by, when he was still just E. Rutherford, no, not yet Lord Rutherford, just radioactivity, dedicated to J.J. Thomson, who was his great mentor at the Cavendish in Cambridge. It's just called radioactivity. Within a few years, just a handful of years, it was completely rewritten, and instead of just radioactivity, now it's radioactive substances and their radiations. And towards what turned out to be the close of his great career in 1930 with James Chadwick and C.D. Ellis, Radiations from Radioactive Substances. All of this was to disclose for the first time that radioactivity is a quality of the center of the atoms. It occurs in nature. There is always a radioactive release of heat, of energy. What we had learned to do by the early 1940s was to speed up what would have been a natural process through a conscious ecology, changing all the way the very materia that we were working with, the very procedures of action that we were working with, methods and things. We were able to use experiment to transform our experience. But even deeper, we were able to understand that experiment is history. and that experience had largely been mythical, except for very few literate men and women for the last 2,500 years had not really understood that experiment is a historical endeavor and that it transforms the mythic horizon, so that one is able to look over the mythic horizon and see that there are any number of possible horizons. And so there isn't just a history, but there are histories without number, but some of them extremely impressive. And one of the first of the most impressive of all of the histories was Thucydides, who says right at the beginning, knowing now what I am able to be conscious of, what I am about to write will happen again and again unless readers learn to do something different. We are condemned to repeat history if we ignore it, is the late 19th century equivalent of Thucydides. What became apparent in the 1940s was that nature also is transformed by the field of consciousness, so that one cannot go back to an idea of nature, to an experience of nature, to a ritual method of nature, to a ritual temporality of nature. What you arrive at is not the zero field of nature. What you arrive at is the mind's commandeering of the existentiality of things and their actions. So that one has a closed short circuit, which then becomes the doctrine, the principle of what one considers real, namely this power. That power always cannot be contained unless one keeps building stronger and stronger containers so that the delusion grows. This is the nightmare of it. There is no end to the prideful swelling of the power. There is an end to the ability to contain it. It led Bertrand Russell to say towards the end of his life, he was a nonagenarian in his 90s. He said, man has never built a weapon he hasn't used. And given the nature of man, he eventually will have a nuclear war that will obliterate life on the planet. Bohr and people like myself, like Huinig, like Nagarjuna, understand that you can dissolve the delusion so that not only do you not need the more and more powerful containers, because there is nothing to contain. The classic way of describing this is a great ball that has all of its air pumped out. This is then a vacuum sealed, a hermetically sealed ball, and all the king's horses and all the king's men attached to trying to pull that apart cannot do so. But it will explode eventually because it is a bomb. It literally is a bomb. Delusion is a bomb. Illusion is like being lost. Delusion is like getting ready for suicide. There is no way to pursue that at all in terms of trying to get on the high side of it, of power. The greatest karmic yogi of the 20th century was Gandhi. He said, there is no way that we can overcome violence with violence. It becomes like a nightmare forest fire feeding on itself, which it will do. At a nuclear forest fire, at that scale, there are maybe 30,000 nuclear weapons on the planet. Even 1% of that would obliterate life. But one can dissolve the parentheticalness of the delusion, either by going back to the zero field of nature in a primordial way, or going into the infinite field of consciousness in a pristine way. And the dissolving, it's called the dissolution, is instantaneous. If it is shared, anyone who shares it, literally, the colloquial word is wakes up. You are no longer in that nightmare configuration or that nightmare state. The difficulty for us is that the mathematics of something like string theory by 2010 is so complex, one would have to study longer than you would be able to live ordinarily to master the manipulations of the protection, which actually is not a protection at all. It's an encouragement for a faster pace of nightmare. What we're looking at is a completely new way to give ourselves the dimensionality to allow us to operate freely, either in zero or in infinite fields, or together. And it's together not as a synergy, but the first word that comes into place is complementarity. And the difference is the difference between the nature of the universe and the conscious universe, but the conscious universe is not a universe. In 1950, when Fred Hoyle first wrote The Nature of the Universe, he put a prescient paragraph in. You could buy this in any drugstore in the English-speaking world at that time. I bought this copy when I was about 12 years old. Perhaps I had better end by saying how I should arrange matters if it were my decision to make. It seems to me that the greatest lesson of adult life is that one's own consciousness is not enough. What one of us would not like to share the consciousness of half a dozen chosen individuals? What writer would not like to share the consciousness of Shakespeare? What musician that of Beethoven or Mozart? What mathematician that of Gauss? What I would choose would be an evolution of life, whereby the essence of each of us becomes welded together in some vastly larger and more potent structure. I think such a dynamic evolution would be more in keeping with the grandeur of the physical universe than the static picture offered by formal religions. More next week.